outside of Berkeley. You're absolutely right.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
there's always been an interplay between the law and the free speech limits. It's just because it's the Supreme Court, U.S. Constitution, the U.S. Constitution is explicit. That's why we need the courts to tell us where that line is. And it's makes it difficult to plan because you don't know until after you have a court case where the line was.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I do recall, though, I mean, I'm not as versed on this, but specifically with the Black Lives Matter protests, in my limited understanding, I do recall that sometimes families would sue an entire police department or sue a city for behavior or lack of behavior. And they seem to get that case pretty far up the legal chain to high levels of the court. I mean, it wasn't laughed away immediately. Is there something here for that, possibly at a civil level, maybe?
Well, yeah, civil level, maybe. Civil's easier than criminal, generally. So when you go to when you try to hold somebody criminally liable, again, you have a whole layer of U.S. constitutional protections. And, the Civil Rights Amendments, 13th, 14th Amendment, moved a lot of the constitutional protections down to the state level. So up until we had them, there was some argument whether some of these U.S. constitutional protections extended to the states. But now we know in a lot of cases they do. So, you can't put somebody in jail unless you give them due process of law.
Of course.
And in a criminal context, that means, guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's a very high standard. So it's hard. Civil's easier. Civil's generally 51%, right? Preponderance of the evidence. Just a little more likely that you're right than the other person's right. It's not such a high bar on that. So there may be stuff there on the civil liability because it's not such a high bar, right? Did you go to the beach? Is it likely you got the disease? Is it likely you brought the disease home? Is it likely I got sick because of you? And was it reasonable for you to go to the beach? Boom, boom, boom. Maybe more likely that you could do a civil liability, than a criminal liability. And just to close off kind of what you were talking about with the, officer shootings, a lot of those are civil rights cases. So because of the racial issues and other things, there's, federal civil rights legislation, which often gives them a lot of life.
Oh, okay.
So you have a federal civil rights statute, which basically says if you deny somebody their civil rights, you have a cause of action. So a lot of times those police shootings are getting life under those. And that may not be applicable here.
Thank you. Thank you. Could I ask you one last question?
Sure.
I'm your busy man. One last question. Okay, so April 13th, there was a blog by the UC Berkeley Constitution Center that said basically California can't close the border with other states. So California has a secure in place position. Everybody's super locked down. The federal government's talking about having a different policy for locking down. Mm-hmm. Governor Newsom signaling that he's going to do his own thing with his Western States Act. He didn't say exactly what he was going to do, but he signaled. And so people are going, what does that mean? Well, there's the UC Berkeley Constitution Center, which is one of the top constitution centers here. And no, it's not legally binding. And yes, it's just a blog. But when these people talk, it's not uncommon to see a law a few months later that resembles closely what they were saying. Of course, nobody said that, blah, blah, blah. And they're saying, Governor Newsom, hey, I understand we have shelter in place orders. I understand everybody's doing it here in California largely. And I understand people's lives are at risk, but you can't stop interstate commerce. So if somebody comes from Kentucky and they watch news that tells them every minute of that truck ride to the California border that COVID-19 is a fake Chinese made up something, and you don't need to take it seriously, and they come into the California border, you have to let them in. And the only thing you can do is check them for a face mask at the border coming into California and say, hey, you should wear a face mask when you come in. But you cannot guarantee that they don't immediately take the face mask down the moment and go past the border and go, ha, ha, ha. I politically don't believe in this because I have my alternative TV that tells me not to believe you. And so No, I'm not in my heart mean. No, I don't think I'm hurting anybody. In fact, I think I'm not hurting anybody, but I'm a truck driver. I come from Kentucky, and now I'm spreading the disease at local gas stations.
Yes.
Really? We have to accept this?
Basically, yes. As the Commerce Clause, a lot of historians view the Commerce Clause is a very powerful clause, which basically says, the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. Query, when the U.S. Constitution was written, there wasn't nearly as much interstate commerce as there was back then, right? We didn't have the airport system we had, obviously didn't have airplanes, didn't have trucking like we had. I mean, you had wagons maybe going between states, you had people riding horses between states, but the other than the border areas, stuff wasn't largely moving across state lines. But what the founders didn't want is they didn't want one state blocking another state from doing business with each other, right? They wanted goods to be able to move between the states, and there's been a lot of Supreme Court cases over that over the years about how much can you move stuff into a state. So basically, the Supreme Court cases have largely said while something's in interstate commerce, it's federal, right? So if it's moving from one state to another, if the federal government says it can move, then it can move. Once stuff comes to rest in the state, however, then it's no longer interstate commerce. So that truck driver, probably in interstate commerce, right? They're bringing goods in there. At some point, their journey of interstate commerce comes to a rest, right? Either they drop the goods off and they turn around and they leave the state, in which case that's probably all under the Commerce Clause, or they drop the goods off and they stop being in interstate commerce, right? They're now no longer engaged in commercial activity, right? They dropped the goods off and they didn't leave to pick up another truckload of stuff. Now they're just hanging out in California. And basically at that point, now California law can apply, right? You can prohibit them from going to the beach just like you can prohibit a California resident from going to the beach. You can say you have to wear a face mask in public if you're requiring you can't treat them differently than your local residents.
Right.
But once the interstate commerce has come to an end, they're subject to your local rules, right? I mean, truck driver can't come into California, and then stop trucking and take guns all over the state, right, in violation of local California laws, right? At some point, the local laws take over once the interstate commerce ends. So we already have that. So that's where you're going to draw that line, right? So you got to figure out whether this truck driver is still in interstate commerce or whether the interstate commerce is ended. And then once the interstate commerce is ended, then yes, indeed, California law can take over and control and dictate their behavior.
That's awesome that you said that. Awesome, because that's exactly what they also said in that article. That basically,
I hadn't read that article, but that was okay. So we had the same.
I mean, that's why I want to ask, because I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what to think, and we're at the law level. And Newsom, I like him, but he's doing a lot of here it is, and because they have to respond quickly. So a lot of us in the public are going, what's going, how, what, huh, what? So I'm trying to follow along. They also said, okay, you can make them wear a mask at the border and trust they're going to keep using it. They cannot stop for more than 2 hours in any one place in LA. And they even put in there, which is long enough to get gas or unload cargo. So they're thinking drive through, get gas, unload cargo, and then you get back in the truck and you're largely still moving. If that's the case, they can't do anything. You're able to move through. If you stay more than 2 hours, they said California has the right to ask you to stay quarantined for 2 weeks.
Yeah. And that's going to be arguable. I mean, I think I could see cases going both ways on that. The 2 hours looks like it's arbitrary. I can certainly see some stuff, depending on what you're delivering. It may take more than 2 hours to unload the truck, right? If you're got some kind of specialized good where you have to carefully unload it, or you need a crane to take something off a truck or whatever. So the 2 hour limit looks arbitrary. It doesn't seem to be determinative whether something's under